Dear colleagues, dear friends, dear Anu, let me start by saying that I'm very delighted to open today's European Parliament Library Book Talk featuring Columbia Law professor and an old friend of mine, Anu Bradford's new book on digital empires. Thank you, Anu, for being here. Thank you to our services and to our Secretary General and his deputy for making such conversations happen here. Today, Anu, we are glad to have you back for a timely discussion about digital empires, the global battle to regulate technology. And in your new book, you say that there are three competing visions, each with a different focus. A libertarian view, prevalent in the US, averse to regulation for fear of stifling innovation, although you say that is currently under review, even in the United States. Secondly, a Chinese approach which puts the state at center stage in order to gain leverage in technological developments, but also has a political agenda and aims to control society. But then there is a third vision. The EU has opted for a rights-driven approach which is citizen-focused and human-centric, and this is the approach that this Parliament fully champions. Irene Tenagli, chair of our Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, is here to join the discussion, and I'm sure she will share an outlook on digital regulation from that perspective. This Parliament led the adoption of two key pieces of EU legislation that lay down ground rules in the digital sphere. Firstly, the Digital Markets Act, which radically changes how large digital platforms are allowed to operate in the European Union, with the protection of end users at its core. Andreas Schwab, the rapporteur, is here, who pushes tirelessly for fair competition, will share his views with us too. And secondly, the Digital Services Act, which is about holding digital services providers to account, particularly with regard to the dissemination of illegal or fake content that causes societal harms. I'm so proud of the work we've done in this legislature and how we managed to get these seminal pieces of legislation adopted in record time. Now our challenge needs to be shifted to keeping a close eye on compliance and enforcement as the legislation comes into force. We're also working on an Artificial Intelligence Act. We have been a global frontrunner here with continents, other countries looking at what we do here, parliaments who are watching this space in order to do the same, to go forward in regulating what was previously an unregulated area. Dragos Tudorache, our colleague, is a leader on our work on AI, and he's here and able to go into more detail later on. So the EU, as I've just tried in a couple of paragraphs to showcase, is a trailblazer in digital regulation. And as in your previous book, Anu, The Brussels Effect, we have shown that we have been able to lead globally on privacy standards with the General Data Protection Regulation, but of course we also know that there is much more to be done. For us, it is about having that human-centric approach that adheres to European values, and I think that approach works. Anu, thank you also that in your book you give credit to the European Parliament for what we are doing. And I would argue that in regulating data protection, digital markets, digital services and AI, we are actually just staying true to our guiding principles. Because the digital world is exciting, but it also brings about challenges of our time that we must address. Privacy, cybersecurity, phishing scams, cyberbullying, revenge pornography, the spread of disinformation and misinformation, particularly as we head to the European elections across all 27 EU member states in June. We are the first generation of politicians to face this on such a scale. And ahead of these elections, we must ensure that this will not undermine the foundations of democracy. At the same time, we want the European Union to be a place where innovation thrives. And for that, we need a non-fragmented digital single market within a predictable regulatory space where scientific and technological talent can blossom. We want regulation that strikes the right balance with guardrails to protect our citizens while catching up with a rapidly, sometimes too rapidly, for us changing digital environment. So what we must do is show leadership and convince that European Union digital regulations have got long-term advantages. We are ringing alarm bells to convince the US and others that it is worth hammering out sound digital rules globally. Final words. This digital world that keeps changing every day is advancing faster than we know, faster even than developers predicted. Artificial intelligence is one such field, and AI is not something we should be frightened about, but we must prepare for it to play a much more increasing role in our lives. It will change our world, and this is why we are regulating it, and we will do so before the end of this term. So thank you, Anu, for putting a spotlight on the merits of what we are all trying to achieve in the digital arena. I'm very eager to hear you and all the insights from the colleagues and anybody in this room. Very happy to have as open and frank a conversation as possible. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the opening remarks. My name's Adam Satariano. I'm a technology correspondent for the New York Times, and I write a lot about digital policy, so this is right in the wheelhouse of what I cover. Anu, I guess to start, I'm curious how you came to the idea to write this book. In 2020, you put out The Brussels Effect, which argued how the European Union was in some ways setting global standards for companies and regulation because of the ways it was easier for companies to adopt the European standards globally than do it in this sort of patchwork ways. So what's changed since then that made you want to write this book, and why now?
Great. So thank you so much, President Metsola. Thank you, Roberta, and thank you all for coming and organizing this, and thank you. So this is a sort of a builds on the conversation that I sought to advance with the Brussels Effect. It's still very interested in what is Europe's place in the world. But I think the question that is really important for all of us is to understand what is the EU's place in the digital world. So the last couple of years, we've seen an intensifying tech war between the two digital superpowers, the United States and China. And the public conversations has often then portrayed the EU as being at the mercy of this tech war and really being forced to choose between what China does or what the US does. And my attempt is to show that the EU is not forced to, nor prepared to choose between the American way of building a digital society, nor the Chinese way. But it really has its own way forward. And that is then the motivation is this book, to articulate the European regulatory model and to assess how it fares in this global race to regulate technology and where the European ideology fits in this larger space.
Understood. And why the framing as empires? It's a very provocative title, but it sort of conducts this sort of zero sum in a competition where there has to be winners, there has to be losers, and it seems to limit the possibility for more collaboration.
Yeah, so I know it is probably a provocative title. In many ways, empire is a big word. But I use it metaphorically. But I think there is a reason it is an apt term. Because when the book distinguishes across these three different ways of regulating, it also argues that none of these regulatory models are confined to the jurisdictions themselves. But each digital regulator is also exporting they model. So America is mainly exporting the private power of its tech companies. So the US tech giants are everywhere. So Meta's Facebook has 3 billion users in 160 countries. So that is a way of expanding this American techno-libertarian worldview. China is also an empire, and it's mainly exporting what I call infrastructure power. So Chinese companies are building 5G networks and data centers and undersea cables, smart cities, safe cities along this digital Silk Road, which reaches then across continents. And then what is the export of the Europeans? So it is really what this house is producing. It is digital regulation. So I would love to write the book where we also are exporting a lot of European tech companies and hope that will be still something that we can also do, even though I think we can be a little bit hesitant to say whether we really want the Googles and Metas of the world to be expanding the American sphere of influence. But the Europeans are an empire of regulation. So that is really how, through the Brussels effect, the digital regulations that are drafted in Brussels also find their way to shape the global marketplace. So we have basically the three empires contributing a different layer to digital governance. So we have many markets where you see US tech companies, Chinese infrastructure, and European regulations.
Understood. Madam President, I want to be respectful of your time because I know... Okay. Okay. With that in mind, in the book, you take on this idea that a reason that the European Union has not produced the tech giants of the likes of Google or Meta is because of regulation. And in the book, you seem to argue against that conventional wisdom. And so can you explain why you think regulation is not a product of that and whether or not you see a path for the EU to produce the kind of distinctive tech companies in that way?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, we need to recognize that all regulation is not beneficial, but all regulation is not necessarily also adverse to innovation. So every time we are pursuing digital regulation, it's not that we face a trade-off. And I don't think that the reason that Europe is behind the US in producing tech companies is because we have the GDPR or is because we are now pursuing to regulate AI. So even if we now decided to repeal the GDPR, or if we decided that, okay, let's not go ahead with the AI Act, I'm afraid that there would not be this thriving European tech ecosystem producing a great number of AI unicorns next year. So I want to sort of make this disassociation that digital regulation can be very beneficial, but there's a host of other issues, sort of other elements of the tech ecosystem that the Europeans ought to be mindful of. And it is those other elements that I think do much more in explaining the current innovation gap between the US and the EU. So one is something that also the President mentioned. So digital single market. We still don't have a fully integrated digital single market where our tech companies can scale. That's not the problem that American or Chinese tech companies face. They have a large integrated domestic market. The second that I emphasize is we don't have the same level of depth, robust, integrated capital markets. So it's much harder for EU tech companies to raise funding compared to the opportunities to do so in the United States. And then entrepreneurship and real innovations, they need risk-taking. And I think we are lagging behind the Americans in our appetite for risk-taking. It is partially a cultural, it's a matter of mentality, but partially it is also the matter of legislation. So if you look at the bankruptcy laws across the EU countries, they are often punitive. It is very hard for European companies to fail and then go ahead and raise more money. Whereby, if you think about the attitudes in Silicon Valley, it is part of the mentality that you try, you fail, and then you go and raise more money. Because it's almost like a rite of passage that you're just trying hard enough, and then occasionally that means that you fail. And then there's the final thing that I think is extremely important, that you cannot innovate unless you have the innovators. And the Americans have been much better than Europeans in harnessing the global talent to come to the US, partially through the universities, but then also because of the fundraising opportunities that are available. But it's really, if you look at, for instance, over $1 billion startups in the US, over half of them have an immigrant founder. So immigration is a big part of the American success story. And we also see brain drain from Europe to benefit American innovative companies. And that's, I think, something that we would need to have a much more proactive way of attracting the world's best talent. And again, Adam, that has very little to do with GDPR or AI Act. And I think you can have both. You can have the protective rights-based regulations, but you also cannot lose sight of all these other elements that are really important for Europe's future.
And you bring a very European view to the United States, at your university in New York. I'm curious what the reaction is to some of the arguments that you make, which are very pro-European, I would say, and what kind of pushback you get against that in how, if that's changing since the Brussels effect, which at a time the US was even more antagonistic about overregulation.
So I think it depends who you talk to. So there's certain subsegment of the American society that remains very skeptical of regulation, and that is very eager to point out that the Europeans can only regulate, but they are the referee and they can never really play the game. And so there's especially the businesses, the tech giants have had a tough ride occasionally in Europe. So there is sometimes resentment of the way the Europeans regulate. But I would say that many Americans are quite receptive and would like the US to be more like the EU today. So the US attitudes are changing. If you look at the public opinion surveys, Americans now want more regulation. They no longer trust this techno-libertarian view of managing the digital society. And they no longer trust the tech companies. And I think the tech companies have become too powerful in the view of many Americans. And it is just the dysfunction of the American political system. The US Congress doesn't work like this House does, and they are not able to generate regulation. So even if the public opinion is shifting, the political system is not adequately capturing and entrenching that into legislation.
That's a good jumping off point for the second part of our discussion. I'm just going to take a short break here so we can invite some of our other friends up to the stage. And Madam President, thank you very much for taking the time. Appreciate it. I neglected earlier to welcome our online audience, so hello all you on Zoom or whatever you are on. As we get further along, there'll be a portion for questions. If you are online, please feel free to drop questions into the chat, and we have somebody who's monitoring that and who will read out a selection of them. So picking up on where we left off, Mr. Schwab, I'm wondering if you had any reaction to some of the things that were said in terms of Europe's place in the world for digital regulation. And I'm curious what reaction you are getting as you speak with American counterparts about the Digital Markets Act and this fairly robust new law that's coming down the pipe.
Well, thank you, Adam, and thanks to Anu and the President of the Parliament for that great occasion. I think, first of all, it's important to be very clear on the basic fact. The Europeans and the Americans are very strong partners in a globalized world, and we as Europeans have only a chance to put our values in the balance if the Americans share these values. And therefore, what we are doing, I believe, and this might be also a topic of discussion with Anu and my colleagues here, and with you for sure, is that the Americans are growingly understanding that what the Europeans have been doubting about was true. And it's very interesting to see now the court cases that the Section 2 cases that are going in the US are proving all the doubts that Europeans had about American tech firms. So to a certain extent, we have done legislation on competition cases, on elements of strong belief, but sometimes missing the proof. And now the Americans are coming over with the proofs. And that's a very satisfying discovery that can also bring us again closer together. And as I see Alex Stup, a colleague that has started with me in 2004 here, it's true that in Europe at that time, and that was maybe the moment when we lost the battle, at least for a certain time, we were still discussing about minimum harmonization. And the digital markets, they don't care about every country doing its own way. They only matter if we do it together. And I think this is also the big step that we did now with the Digital Markets and the Digital Services Act, that we said, listen, there is one European value that you have to respect, and if you don't, then you will have to fight with all the European community together. And that's what we try to do. And I think that will give our values more strength, and if the Americans show that they share them, I think we have a chance to win.
I was curious what your views were on the Anu's framing about empires, and do you feel that to a certain extent there is this competition of ideas in which Europe is jostling with China to the east and the United States to the west?
Well, I think that what Europe is trying to do is Anu lays out first in the previous book and now here, the regulatory approach, which could be a very efficient way also, because you try to regulate things and then let the market, because the market needs rules, clear rules, to create a level playing field. I think what came out in these past few years is that indeed we were risking disrupting the level playing field, and by letting some giants, some empires, because they are sort of empires, in some cases they are richer than states. And this affects, let aside all ideological things, but it alters the functioning of a market, and think in terms of competition, in terms of new startups or small medium enterprises, which is a strength of the European Union. We do a lot of legislation in trying to support the biodiversity of our industry, of our market, of our trying to make sure that everybody is capable to compete and to thrive. And then you don't see the sudden creation of empires that crush all sorts of possibility for this, because they make the rules. So you abdicate your role of making the rules, because they are the ones that eventually make the rules on how you can access certain types of market. Digital markets now are like physical markets, or even more powerful. So, for example, you have some platforms that they create the rules for according to which certain companies or sellers can access markets, and they can decide who can access, who not, or who has an advantage, who hasn't. So I think it's important to reaffirm the importance of regulation, to recreate a level playing field, and to make sure that all the actors can participate and that the free market is not disruptive. Now, if I may, I still would like to emphasize that this approach is not an easy one when you are confronted, when you are operating in a global scenario where you have China on one hand and the United States on the other hand that have completely different approach, and then it's not that easy. Yes, you set the line. In some cases, they later recognize that on some things we were right. But still, it's not easy to have this approach when you have, for example, giants that are using their fiscal leverage to support certain policies or certain players, to invest in infrastructure, to attract global talent, or to support startups. So we try to support small, medium firms and startups by trying to regulate and create space. Other jurisdictions, they trying to support them just by using the fiscal leverage or money or incentives. It's not that easy to stick to this regulatory approach that is efficient, that is theoretically right, it's correct, preserve the level playing field, but then you have other giant jurisdictions that are using other leverages, and that may put your own companies at a disadvantage sometimes, so or put into question your approach, because sometimes we have companies that question this approach within the European Union and say, you are putting all these regulations, and I'm not referring just to the digital, because this is an approach we are having, for example, on green, on digital transition, but also on green transition, so we use this approach. But it's not that easy. It's not easy to find the timing, for example. When is the right time to intervene with regulation? This is a huge question. For example, in my committee, we have tried to put regulation on crypto assets because we saw that they could become a problem for financial stability. But when is the right timing? Is when they are still small and not so risky, but then you risk interfering with the innovation process. But if you intervene too late, then it's too late. You have a systemic risk coming up. So timing is crucial when you adopt a regulatory approach. It's not always easy to understand when to do it. If you don't have the possibility to accompany these with fiscal leverage tools, incentives, then can be a problem. You can have a political problem to sell this approach, because then you may have companies that say, or actors and players that say, well, you know, this is a problem for competitiveness in certain places. So it's, and also if you are alone in doing this and the other jurisdictions don't follow, you may have loopholes where these empires always find a way to get around the rules that you are playing, so that you are putting. So I think in terms of taxation, for example. So we've been trying to achieve global agreements, for example, on the global minimum taxation for multinationals, for companies. But it's very, very difficult to have agreements on the global level on rules and regulations. So yes, with time, the regulatory approach may win and may affect other jurisdictions, but it's not always easy. When it doesn't happen, if you don't have a global approach, you always have some loopholes, and the empires will always find a way to get around it. So it's not an easy route. It's not an easy path. I think it's the right one, but we need to complement this. We need to work a lot to make it work, and not to find ourselves in a corner.
So man, this mic's giving me trouble. So I've been covering technology first for about 10 years, first in California and Silicon Valley, and now in Europe. And when I talk to people working at startups or companies or others, one thing that comes up, particularly from the United States, is Europe. They're like, what's happening in Europe other than regulation? All it's known for is regulation. That's all what people want to talk about when they're talking about Europe when it comes to technology. And it becomes, even though it might be a conventional wisdom that isn't true, as you are arguing, it is nonetheless the view And I'm wondering what economic impact that has in and of itself, and therefore how you think about when you're policy making, that affects your thinking. Mr. Turaj?
Well, it's a very good point that brings me to a suggestion that if I dare to make a suggestion to Anu for maybe your next book, which is that digital can be the alibi for, in fact, merging the two models, the American and the European model, into one. And this links into your question, Adam. In the literally, I think, thousands of hours of discussions that I've had over the last 3 years with businesses from both sides of the Atlantic, American and Europeans, for me, there's one thing clear, which is that we are condemned to work towards each other in terms of how we approach not only regulation, but also the approach to the ecosystems that we need for innovation. We need to learn how we build those ecosystems that actually are indeed allowing thriving innovation in Europe. And the factors that you mentioned are fully aligned with my thinking. It's not regulation that actually stifles innovation. Yes, it plays a role, but it's not that. It is actually access to capital, it is access to resources, and particularly to human resources. So that's where we need to learn, and we need to put some of the tools that actually the Americans have very usefully played with for the last decades to actually make the US what it is today in terms of the bedrock for technological innovation. So we have to learn, and at least in the context of the AI Act, a lot of what we've tried to do, particularly here in Parliament, and I'm happy that now in the final leg of the negotiations, many of those things still survived in the text. We tried to create that ecosystem, to put the placeholders that would give that incentive to the member states in the way they develop the implementation and enforcement mechanisms for this text, how to actually create the stimulus for companies to stay here, to get the feeling that it's okay for them to innovate, to start up, to scale up here in Europe. And at the same time, if you look from the other end, from the American end, as you rightly said, Arno, and I fully agree, there is now, and I felt it every time I traveled to Washington, there is a bottom-up push now for a change of tack also on the US side as to how to approach possible rulemaking. Of course, it's not going to be simple. We're not going to see horizontal legislation on digital, neither in the sense of the DSA nor in the sense of the AI Act. But I do think that we are going to see bills that will have, in some years' time, the combined effect, the functional equivalence of many of the things that we have adopted during this mandate. And it's not a choice that is a political one, but very much pushed from down below. I looked recently at a research done by Pew Institute, which shows how much the American people are now paying attention to this, how much they actually expect some rulemaking, some standards, some safeguards to come from legislation to provide some of the guarantees that they are looking for when interacting with technology. That call, that push coming again from the society cannot be ignored. And I always tell our American friends, you will either face the choice of looking at the states starting to themselves regulate in the absence of action on the federal level, and I don't think that is going to be a pretty picture on the US, or actually take the responsibility, taking the bull by the horn, and going down the path, not an easy one there, particularly in the political context that we see there, but actually starting to address the issue of regulation. The feeling I have right now, particularly on AI, is that the question as if has left the station in Washington. I think they now understand, at least again, maybe I'm naive, but my feeling is that they now understand that they have to do something. And now they are facing the question of how. And when they face the question of how, they have several options. But no matter how they will exercise those options, I always say there aren't a million ways to regulate technology. You can only look at the use of technology, on the use cases, on the applications. You can only look at the risks that these applications raise, and you have to somehow tackle those risks. And inevitably, you are going to be facing the same questions that we faced as regulators 3 years ago when we started to prepare this legislation. You're going to face the same balance between needing to put some safeguards in place as well as some stimulants for innovation. And inevitably, again, even if the form might look differently, because also we have two different legal systems that have to be taken into account when we look at rulemaking, we are forced here in the EU to be more prescriptive in the way we write our rules, whereas Americans with their judicial system that plays its role in how it details rulemaking will certainly have a different approach in how they formulate the laws. But inevitably, again, I think that we're going to face a future, and I don't think it's going to be a very distant future, where we will be having some form of functional equivalence between how we approach regulation here and how the Americans do. And last but not least, and I think that's important to put, the fact that we have these rules, it's a reality. It can't be changed. We have the DSA, we have the DMA, we have the Data Act, we have the Data Governance Act. Soon, I hope, tick-tock, within the next 3 weeks, we're going to have the Air Act. So this creates a reality here in Europe, which, again, cannot be ignored. Companies will have to come to grip with that reality. And therefore, I think the strive for convergence, the strive for commonality on how we approach standards is something that will have to become a reality as well. And we just have to work on both sides as diligently as we can as regulators towards each other rather than in parallel or even more so against each other. And there's also the geopolitics. I don't want to open the discussion, the geopolitics which is also forcing us to think alike and act alike.
You get into that a bit in your book, in that when you're looking forward, you see much more alignment between the EU and the United States in no small measure because of the shared need for a counterweight, as you say, to China. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think it would be a desirable state of the world if the United States and the EU were able to align and overcome their differences. And I think there's a couple of reasons I'm optimistic that it could happen. So I still struggle with the sort of the legislative dysfunction in the US. And I also think there's tremendous uncertainty with the upcoming elections, how the cooperation of the executive branches is going to look like if we don't see President Biden continue. And I think the Europeans are very aware that they cannot be at the mercy of US elections every 4 years. So there's an element of unpredictability. But I think there are certain forces, both internal and external, in the United States and in the EU that I think make the case for closer transatlantic alignment. So one is that the United States is now changing in its own view. So we talked about the internal shift, the public opinion starting to move closer to where the EU is. The other one is that this cadre of European regulations are in fact already setting the rules for the marketplace. And Americans face a choice whether they continue to outsource the regulation of the tech companies to the Europeans or whether they rather want to set those rules jointly with the EU and try to coordinate and be then not a rule taker, but also be part of that conversation. And the third one is that there is a shared concern of the rising digital authoritarianism and China's influence around the world. So there is a sense that we need to consolidate the democratic front, and we still share a view of the digital society that is very different to the kind of society that China is envisioning and exporting. And I think that is a big motivating factor. And I think has been also then sort of led to conversations in Trade and Technology Council where the US and the EU are trying to work more closely together. There had been some tension in the sort of more geopolitical narrative whereby the Americans have taken a harder line against China. But there I see in the last year, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and China's refusal to condemn that invasion, that the Europeans have also been prepared to take a harder line with respect to China. And now this European articulated de-risking narrative is pretty much a shared narrative. So I do see that there is certainly a case for closer transatlantic alignment for both internal and external reasons.
A question I had in reading the book is because we have these three blocks, so to speak, is there room for a fourth? You have the United States, Europe, and China, which are incredibly big and influential and economically the major players in the world, but that leaves a lot of the world out. And so what does that leave for other parts of the world as they make decisions about what they want their digital economy to look like? I'd be curious what you think. No?
This is the toughest question, right, to me. Okay. I don't know, honestly. I don't have an answer. My fear is that actually what we are seeing, these three blocks are actually, and especially two and one, they are trying to exert their influence in other parts. So my fear is not so much that we might have a fourth model emerging, but that we might have the third model, one of these three models, trying to colonize other parts of the globe. So this is a little bit my fear right now, because then when you have this as Anu rightly says, you have a sort of an overlapping, or at least, between the digital model, but also geopolitical tensions and considerations, and they start to, so you may see the American model and the EU model getting closer for geopolitical reasons to address certain threats, but you may also see the reverse. So you may see on the other side the Chinese model trying to find different allies or other. So I see more maybe the attempt of these three blocks and trying to expand and get more influence in other parts of the world, rather than seeing a fourth model emerging. Also because I don't know what this fourth model could be, but maybe Anu, that has a better knowledge and ability to see in this sector and the dynamics may have a different insights. But if I may, just one thing that to complement what I was saying before about the European Union, and I see a lot of criticism of this approach also in the United States. They are very much afraid of too much regulation, or so there might be a political resistance to this. But I think that what Europe could and should do is to complement this approach with a further step ahead in its integration, because the problem that we see now, that you said it very nicely, that even those actors that complain about competitiveness and they might blame on regulation, but it's not that. It's because we still don't have capital markets union. We still have 27 different, fiscal policies. We still are lagging behind the process of integration that would help our competitiveness, our innovation. So that's where we need to push and to show the rest of the world that when you complement a good, sound regulatory approach with a real integration in terms of fiscal capacity, fiscal policies, in terms of innovation policies, in terms of capital markets union, then you have a real superpower that can really compete globally. And this is the challenge that I think we have. And we are trying to push, but it's really hard.
Well, politically, it's very difficult as well, although that view is, I think, very popular in Brussels. In many countries within the EU, that sort of integration is not as popular. And so one thing that comes up a lot, not just with respect to Europe, but the United States and China, is the digital fragmentation. And so as these different blocks take hold, there's more fragmentation of the digital economy and the internet. And there was one example that came up recently, which had to do with the new social media app Threads, which is Meta's version of Twitter. And that's not available in the EU. And on the one hand, you think, who cares? We don't really need one more Twitter-like app. It's done enough damage as it has. But on the other hand, maybe that's a sign of things to come, where companies decide, I'm not going to release that here, but I will there. And I wonder if that is an acceptable outcome in your view.
Well, to be answering directly, Adam, to your question, I'm also on Blue Sky. So if you want to experience the alternative to Twitter, you can do that, and you may choose later. But what I wanted to add here on that point, I think these digital empires, as Anu has perfectly described them, they are about power. So the advantage of the American one, it's just pure capitalism. So it's just about money. So if you regulate, because of compliance obligations, these companies will reign. They have no choice because they are about the money that they can earn, and they want to try at least to earn it fairly, let's say legally, not fairly, but legally. And that's a big difference to China. And I think you're very candid in your book writing, I have read it. A state control does not everything in China. I think it's too candid because, in fact, if you are moving around in a way that the authoritarian system in China, which is digitally controlling you, is not agreeing to you, they will meet you and they will ask you, what have you done? Why do you go left on that street and not right? They follow you. And so I think that comment on the Chinese system seems to me too candid. Therefore, I believe, and I also would like to prove you this, our model, our European model will lead in that way. The Japanese are just about to adopt a law similar to the DMA. In South America, Brazil is about to discuss. Google is doing a huge campaign against that law there. It's the same also in Australia and New Zealand. I think we have a real chance that that value-based model that the Americans are not against, but have not the power with their political system to do it themselves, can win. And that will be a huge advantage for the world in economic terms. So DMA-like competition policy. The problem that we are facing a bit, and this was your question on Twitter, with the Digital Services Act, we are defending free speech. And that is an issue which will always remain a difficult battle, because if no one can decide what disinformation is, but we ban it from platforms, we know that this is a very difficult bare knuckles right that we have to define every day anew. And this is a challenge that we will have to fight with different arguments within Europe, but also with other parts of the world. And it will not be easy, because what is free speech in Germany is already different in Finland or in Italy. Not that much, but a bit. And therefore, there are different rules to be applied. And that will always remain a challenge for us. But I think we can make it.
I'd like to turn the conversation a bit to artificial intelligence, because it's such a hot topic right now. And I think it captures the themes of your book really, really well, because it's an issue that the technology is evolving at an incredibly rapid pace in ways in which we don't really know what the systems are going to be able to do, and the risks are kind of, we don't have a full grasp of what they might be yet. But everyone, as you said, there's agreement that something needs to be done. The what should be done is where there isn't broad global agreement. So Dragoș, can you talk to us a little bit about what the AI Act is, why you took this approach, and really, if you think that there is room for the kind of global cooperation that perhaps more than any other technology there is needed to hoard off some of the biggest risks?
Well, how much time do you have? So I'm not going to endeavor to explain the AI Act here. I don't think, again, we have the time. But I'll just say that I think for us as legislators, and it started with the approach that the Commission has taken, I think the choices we had was, okay, can we afford to do nothing? Can we afford to look at the technology evolve, play out, both the benefits but also the risks, and rely solely on the moral compass of companies, as we have done so far with social media platforms, and we saw the results. And clearly, the answer to that question was, no, we cannot afford to do that. So we have to put rules in place to put safeguards and guarantee those safeguards with hard rules. Boom. So we've passed that question. And then, again, just as the American friends are now facing the question of how, we also faced the question of how 3-4 years ago. That's the only distinction. We did that 4 years ago. And our answer was again, we cannot condemn the technology. We cannot rule or provide rules for the technology itself. That's crazy. You can't do that. It keeps on leaping forward, so you can't catch it. You can capture it in a rule. So you have to look at the use of technology. And then differentiate between the uses that are providing risks and then addressing and mitigating those risks through obligations. And then, very importantly, leaving those that do not raise risks to roam free. Because, again, the balance between putting rules in place and safeguards as well as creating a space for innovation was fundamental. And I always say this regulation is not only human-centric, it is also innovation-centric. So how did we do that? Well, we have the risks that we consider to be absolutely unacceptable because they are totally incongruent with our values, and therefore we say we do not want them in our market. And then we have a closed list of what those risks are and those applications of AI. And looking at the other model, the Chinese one, in fact, many of the prohibitions are fashioned to what the Chinese are having at the very core of their model. And I think that says and speaks volumes for the dichotomy of the models. And then we have a second layer, which is the high-risk applications, and where, again, our effort over the last years in negotiating this was to make them as clear, as narrow, as precise as possible. Because we believe we owe to the companies precision in lawmaking so that only those that really bring about risks need to comply with legislation. And then the vast majority of AI, which will be totally unregulated. The big challenge for us, and now it is a challenge for the whole world, and this brings me to the issue of convergence and the effort that we need to do globally. The big challenge was when people started to put foundational models on the table. Because there you do kind of depart from the logic of the text, that you only look at the applications and at the risks that the applications are raising. Because with foundation models, you actually look at the technology. You actually look at the intrinsic characteristics of what these models are and how they function, and you see that there are some risks that are built into the way these models are created. So there we took a political responsibility. Us here in Parliament, the Commission was too early with their text. Nobody was really paying much attention to models 4 years ago. Then the Council looked at it strictly from a value chain perspective, recognizing that in the value chain of AI, those developers of general purpose AI would still need to have some responsibility for those down the value chain in order for them to comply later on. But we in Parliament said, no, we will need a regime that is catered for the specifics of foundation models. And we did so. We deliberately did so broadly. So I agree, and I say it now publicly, that the definition that we have introduced in the text of foundation models is broad. And what we're doing right now, as we speak in these days, ahead of the next trilogue, is to try and find a way to differentiate within the definition that we've made, so that we make sure that we attach the rules for foundation models to those models that actually are indeed most likely to bring about the risks that we want to protect from, and leave other models to have either a lighter touch set of obligations or maybe also no obligation at all. So I can already say that we are heading in that direction. There was already a political discussion at the last trilogue that we are going to start narrowing down and creating a 2- or 3-tier approach within the definition of foundation models, and then again apply the rules differently along those thresholds between the categories. We are hard at work trying to figure out what should be the best criteria that would be attached to those thresholds. It's not an easy thing. Should you look at the parameters? Is that a good technical criteria? Should you look at the market and the market reach of some of these models? So we are playing with these concepts right now, but I'm convinced that at the end we are going to have a regime for foundation models, which is also going to play into the broader global effort, which is done right now, both in the Hiroshima process. We're going to see also the London UK Safety Summit trying to focus on that. The whole world realizing that there needs to be a governance in place for these models because of the very serious risks that they put on the table.
You raise a good point about how these foundation models, these are the sort of AI systems in which ChatGPT and all these new AI systems are based upon. When the first draft of this bill was released, they don't discuss it because they were not top of mind. But now, of course, the conversation is almost exclusively about that. So it raises an interesting question about how, particularly in digital, and you talked about this before, about when do you decide to regulate, and how can policymakers keep pace with technology. And I'm curious, Anu, in some of the research that you've done, how you think when is the appropriate moment. In the EU, it seems to be to move quickly and be first in a way, whereas others take more of a wait and see approach. Am I reading that correctly?
So I think, yes, Adam, we're never going to beat China in speed. I think democracy slows things down, and there are many hurdles in creating legislation in the EU. But for instance, how quickly the DMA ultimately was passed, I thought that was very fast. And I think we just need to be aware of the trade-offs involved when we set the goals for speed. So the more we wait, the more technology will evolve absent those guardrails. And I am concerned that even if we had the AI Act adopted by the end of this year, it's still going to be a couple of years before it actually starts constraining these companies. And that is a lifetime in the age of generative AI. And the more we wait, the more the existing front runners can entrench their existing market position. And that we have noticed is very hard to undo. So there is certainly a cost in waiting as well. But there is the American view is that the technology is so fast evolving, we still need to learn about it. And it can also be costly if you move in too early and then your legislation is out of date by the time it is being applied. So I think that just then sets some constraints in how precise you can be in regulating. Can you make sure that the regulation is agile enough, it's nimble enough, and it needs some space also that is left to those who enforce it, so that it is not then too much of a straitjacket. But I want to mention here there's a concern in the US in particular, that the lawmakers shouldn't get involved because they don't understand the technology. And there's been listening to the hearings in US Congress and say that this technology is way fast moving, so you don't try to get in now or you will get it wrong. And here I would really like to sort of take the side that the regulators ought to be driving the process, even if technology is fast moving and complex. So first of all, we regulate a lot of industries that are out of the sort of the comfort zone or deep knowledge of the legislators. So they don't know how to build planes, yet we are all pretty comfortable that we regulate airline safety. The same thing, our lawmakers don't know how to develop vaccines or just generally know the details of medicine, and all of us think that the pharmaceutical industry ought to be regulated. And then when it comes to AI, this is not just about technology. It is really also about how technology affects democratic structures of the society, how it affects the fundamental rights of individuals. And the tech companies have no expertise to say that they ought to be put in charge of our democracy and the fundamental rights. So in many ways, I think from the get-go, the lawmakers need to be involved so that these other issues are going to be at the front and center in building the governance model. But yes, the trade-off, I think, is inevitable, and there is such thing as going too early, going with too precise regulation, but there's also a cost in waiting.
Please.
Sorry, 1 minute on this, because I think it's very important. Anyone that has ever spoken to a US senator or a representative would know that they are not quick at the gun at saying that the EU does something right. But where they do say that we did something right on AI is that we actually took the time to first learn. And I really want to praise, since Roberta was here and we're doing this under the auspices of the presidency of this parliament, I do want to praise the leadership of this parliament, who had the foresight 3 years ago, more than 3 years ago, to actually establish a special committee on AI, which allowed us as legislators to actually compensate for that gap. Because it's true, at the start of this mandate, I knew this much about AI, and like me, all the other shadow rapporteurs. So, but through the work of that committee, which did its work prior to the legislation coming on our table, we actually grew, we educated ourselves, and we grew collectively as a body of legislators to be prepared for the moment when the legislation came. And in fact, again, what fellow congressmen and women are saying now in the US, that they are trying in a very accelerated process to do the same in the next months, to actually invest a lot in raising not only the awareness, but actually the understanding of representatives as to what AI is, what is the impact, and what could be the options to actually tackle regulation. And therefore equip themselves with for the moment when they might actually endeavor to do so.
We're going to turn it over to questions in just a moment, but I want to give you the last word since you're the guest of honor. Is there something that you want to leave the people in the room and the policymakers at the table with as they try to confront some of these thorny topics?
So thank you for the opportunity, Adam. I guess there's one issue that we haven't really touched on that does give me a great deal of concern, and that is when we are trying to legislate in this era of geopolitical turmoil and uncertainty. And I think that has really shifted the priorities of the US and the EU, and sometimes it seems to be that we are forgetting what our comparative advantage is and what our true values are. So one reason the European model has been so successful is that it has reflected the values that resonate with European people and people around the world. But now I think there's this tendency to really start focusing on strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty and start converting regulation as a tool for industrial policy. And there's a lot of pressure to subsidize our way towards sovereignty, and I don't think we are going to win that game. I think the United States is walking away from many of its own strengths and increasingly playing Beijing's game. So the US is very actively pursuing export controls, investment restrictions, both inbound and outbound. And when we start also then pursuing human decoupling, that is also where I think the US is forgetting its greatest strength, which is that it has been able to draw on migrants, including Chinese migrants, that are benefiting the innovation economy. So I think my message to this House would be that for instance, if you take the Brussels effect seriously, you need to realize that it is a tool to export good and bad regulations alike. And if we start then enacting protectionist regulations in this House, this is what the European companies are going to find when they are trying to acquire, let's say they go to Brazil and try to acquire a Brazilian target. And if the Brazilians look at us and we have converted our competition law in the tool for building national champions, that is exactly what they are going to do as well. So in many ways, I think we cannot forget why we regulate, what is the vision of the society, and what are the appropriate tools to get Europe there.
With that, I want to open up the floor for some questions. Yes, please, by all means. We were lucky enough to have the former Prime Minister of Finland here. Can we have the microphones out for the guests, please?
I'll keep one here so we can share.
Help yourself, that's a principle in Europe.
Yeah, otherwise I would have asked Anno a question in Finnish, and that would have been No, it's very nice to be here, and thanks for a super interesting panel. I'll make one general observation, then I'll address my question to Anno, because I know what Andreas is going to say. We've been working together in the Internal Market Committee for many, many years. My general observation is that I was actually working on a book which was called Digital Democracy or Digital Dictatorship, which is very much up the alley of what you're writing. I since converted to working on New World Disorder. And the way in which I looked at it was perhaps a little bit different, that the Chinese approach on data is to centralize it and to have it in government. The American approach to data, as you put it in tech, is to have it on the market and with the companies. And then the European view on data is quite simple. It's very private. It's based on privacy. Two questions. The first one is, what would be your advice to our legislators here in the room of what would be the best parts of the American way of dealing with data and what would be the best parts of the Chinese way of dealing with data that our legislators should look at? Second question. I think some people are too quick to think that the Chinese model linked to artificial intelligence or generative AI is going to work in China. Because if I was the president of of the Chinese Communist Party, which I'm happily not, I would be a little bit worried what kind of algorithms I'd be feeding to language models dealing with the Chinese Communist Party. So could we actually be looking with a reversal where, first we thought that we get digital democracies, now we saw that we're going to start getting digital autocracies. Could we be looking at a perhaps conversion back to the free world on this?
Very good. Thank you, Alex. Let me take the second one first. So this is, I think, a huge dilemma for the Chinese Communist Party. So they basically have a two-pronged goal. One is that they want to make China a technological superpower, which then also entails that China needs to lead in AI revolution. The other one is that they need to maintain the political grip of the Communist Party to preserve social stability in the country. And sometimes those two are in tension. And where I think the tension is really evident is in how they regulate generative AI. Because those large language models are better if you can tap into a tremendous amount of data. But that data in China needs to go through the censorship apparatus, which then limits the data available for generative AI. So this is something that I think is really tremendously interesting, because one of the sort of inevitable but uncomfortable conclusions of the book was that China has shown to the world that freedom is not necessary for innovation. We'd like to think that you cannot innovate unless you're free. And they have been able to create a thriving digital economy without political freedoms. But this may now be tested with generative AI. If indeed China is not able to catch up on the US, in part because of the imperative for political control, that would then vindicate the American and European view that free societies ultimately thrive also economically. But that's why I think we also saw a shift, that the first draft of the regulation on generative AI was more stringent. And then the Communist Party has been pulling it back to some extent because it's still worried about innovation as well. So what can we learn from the sort of Chinese data governance that really relies on data localization, which seems to be embraced by some European leaders, that the idea that data privacy ultimately requires data localization? I think that is a wrong approach and makes it very difficult for us to continue to criticize that Indians and Chinese, for instance, want to pursue data localization. That really balkanizes the global digital economy and introduces cost to all parties. At the same time, China takes the data privacy of individuals seriously. So they get protection vis-a-vis tech companies, not that much vis-a-vis the government. And that's, I think, where the Chinese and Europeans are not that far apart. The American approach, I think there's been obviously a very notorious battles on data transfers because American view on surveillance, and which then comes into conflict with the European view of data protection. And here I think that we Europeans may not be able to afford to be as absolutist in today's world, that we need to recognize that some surveillance is also beneficial. Europeans have benefited of surveillance, of American surveillance in the case of Russian invasion in Ukraine. That has definitely helped. And there are some battles that we actually need to concede, that some surveillance does keep us safer and the geopolitical world much more stable. So I guess there is the balance to be had, that we distinguish across the kind of surveillance that is still part of the legitimate functions of the state, that needs to take care of national security and law enforcement. And I think that is just something that the conversation has sometimes seemed very binary, that also the Americans haven't conceded the benefits and importance of civil liberties and privacy. And I think they have a lot to learn from Europeans. But I think today's geopolitical environment forces us to be sort of less naive, and probably just doesn't give us the luxury anymore to lead with a kind of 100% focus on privacy in the world where surveillance is going to be inevitably part of it.
Any other questions in the room? Yes, you there in the second row, please.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting conference. My name is Stella Velichi. I have studied physics and informatics, and I am a member of the European Physical Society. And I have first an explanation. Somebody asked, when is time with a new regulation? In the new technology, once you have a procedure that you test and they have good results, you need to have a temporary regulation that can can keep the danger of this procedure. You can not have this danger that normally you have it. Another question is a new technology. You have a quantum technology. It will be a very, very big revolution. And my question is, do you have some regulation concerning this new technology? And especially, what is the regulation between US and China concerning quantum technology? And last question is, I don't understand how a private person who has a digital empire or many other empires can decide in a war like Ukraine and Russia, and I am speaking from Elon Musk and Starlink. Can you regulate that? He has a power over the life of a lot of people. No? He has no legalization to do this. How can you regulate this?
Good questions there. I think the question was about bridging when the legislation is passed to when it goes into actual effect, and as well the issue of quantum computing, which raises all sorts of new issues in cybersecurity and others. Does someone want to?
I will address the first question on temporary legislation in these fastly developing areas. It's very difficult because for the lawmaker, it means that you cannot make a decision. And Dragos wants to make a decision, the committee wants to make a decision, so that is very difficult. We have often tried the sandbox approaches. It's very unlikely to happen, I'm sorry. And on quantum, I think it's rather technology than technology concerned in the legislation that is in question here. So I think with the laws that we are doing, we are covering also largely quantum.
What about the question of regulating Elon Musk? Someone want to take jump on that grenade?
I want to add on this part, on the temporary regulation. Of course, it's very difficult to have a temporary regulation, also because the timing, it takes us time to do the whole process, so you don't do it for a temporary thing. But there are some ways, like techniques that allow us to give us some flexibility. So, for example, often what we do is to add a review clause that allow us and say, okay, we do this legislation now, but we task the Commission to provide us with a study on how this has worked in 2 years. So in 2 years, we want to have all the data about how this legislation has affected this is and that variable, and then in case the Commission may take action with an additional piece of legislation. Another technique is that sometimes there could be, if there are aspects that are too technical for us to decide, or we may delegate an authority and leave it at a second level, as we say, for example, in the crypto assets, we were not ready, we didn't think it was the case to regulate on NFTs, and say, okay, let's leave it aside from the regulation, let's delegate the Commission to further think about it and to propose something in 1 year or 2 years' time after that there has been an additional time or study about the development of this. So there are ways to create margins of flexibility in the legislation, even if it's not a temporary one. And this is something that in the EU it is possible in Brussels compared to maybe national laws, because we do have normally 5 years term ahead of us. We have less turbulences, so we can take the time to do the legislation. And then also every legislature, we work on reviewing what we've done in the past. There is not so much stratification of different laws that sometimes we see in national governments, but it's a path. So it's important that we start early, maybe gradually, and then we build on that. We may review in the future, but this paves the way and sets some standards in a gradual way. So this is how we are trying to approach it when we have to regulate on very new technologies.
Let's take from the online audience, please.
Thank you. The online audience seems to be also interested in data privacy. So there was one question from Dirfan Hartman from Euractiv, and he was interested in Anu Bradford's view on the data privacy framework between the US and the EU. And can we consider it as a breakthrough for US finally respecting the EU GDPR, or the EU respecting the FISA law of mass surveillance?
So whether this is a breakthrough, I think remains to be seen. I think Americans certainly frame it that they have made many compromises and shifted not in a non-trivial way towards the European privacy framework. But at the same time, if you ask the privacy activist Max Schrems, who is behind these 2 lawsuits that led to the collapse of the earlier privacy data transfer deals between the US and the EU, he certainly says this is not yet adequate level of protection, and he is gearing up ready to challenge that, and ultimately then we would find out whether our courts would agree. So I think there's still uncertainty around this. I personally would think that the Americans would do well for the country to adopt a really federal privacy law. I don't think that is likely. That would have been a principal way for the Americans also to deal issues like TikTok, that they are now trying to figure out how do they deal with TikTok's data practices in the US. But I certainly think that the Americans have come a long way, and there is a deep interest among the Americans and Europeans for this deal to hold. We cannot imagine a functioning economy without an ability to quite effortlessly move data between the US and the EU. But I fully understand the deep concerns that have prevented these deals from really gaining the deep trust of Europeans in the past. So I would say that we've come a longer way. The US is closer to the EU, but it is not the same as having a GDPR type of full protections in the US. So I think the last chapter is still to be fully written. Can I say a word about Elon Musk? The earlier question?
By all means.
So I don't know whether I should even volunteer to speak about him, but it's one of the moments that really gives me a deep sense of discomfort when I think about if we focus on tech companies or individuals as the true empires, making critical decisions about some of the hardest geopolitical conflicts in the world, that no individual really has the capacity to adequately deliberate and decide on. So I think it's one thing to try to make sure that Elon Musk's X complies with DSA. The Europeans have the means to hold him accountable there. But you have many more options of restraining somebody like Elon Musk if you can provide an alternative. So who provides the technology then keeps the internet alive if he does not? The same way when I was saying earlier that the Europeans would have an easier time telling countries not to accept the Chinese infrastructure if the Europeans can offer an alternative and basically build a path to digital development for countries around the world. The same way that there is not necessarily short of nationalizing Starlink, and I think that is a very hard call to do. Elon Musk himself would probably need to understand the limits of his capaciousness and delegate some of the decisions to sort of democratic institutions and those that ought to be at the center of making them. But I think he's not necessarily willing to do that. So I just wanted to sort of recognize that you brought an issue that is very central, but where there's not necessarily an immediate solution, but where the status quo is really disturbing.
Yeah, it raises a question of, you were making the point that some of these companies are becoming sort of global economies of themselves. He is an individual who does. We did an investigation about just this earlier this year. Sorry for the self-plug, but one thing that came away from it is that there's this give and take, particularly with the United States military, because so many of their contracts come from the Pentagon. And so you have the United States military, which is dependent on Elon Musk, but he's also dependent on them. And so they're almost negotiating with him as if he is a government. So, other questions from the audience related to Elon Musk or not? Yes, you in the back.
Thank you very much for this discussion, and thank you very much for the presentations. My name is Svetlana, and I'm representative of Business Europe. It's the Confederation of European Industries. And as a cross-sectorial association, digital regulation is part of the regulation that faces companies. And my question here is, since we heard that the existence and the amount of regulation doesn't really impact the companies that are innovating in Europe, etc., etc. I wanted to ask to the author, but also maybe to the entire panel, have you come across to some of the researchers regarding the amount of regulation, the correlation of cost of compliance, and how does that impact the money available for innovation or for talent attraction and so on and so forth? Because we saw here some claims that also it's the attractiveness of talent that's a big problem in Europe. So that was my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I can comment on that briefly. So I share your concern, in particular, the sort of the distributional aspect of it, that the cost of compliance impact even more the small and medium-sized companies. I am not worried about big tech affording to comply with European regulations. And I think that is one of the clear shortcomings of a regulation like the GDPR, that it was hurting the small and medium-sized companies. I think the DMA and the DSA are by design asymmetrical and adjust the costly obligations so that they target the companies that cause the greatest harm, but also that have the ability to comply. So I think there I completely agree that we need to be mindful of the cost of compliance. At the same time, I would say that like all regulation is not good, but neither is all innovation. And I think ultimately still I am okay with imposing costs that change the pathways of innovation and then potentially generate the benefit that we do not see certain harmful effects of that innovation process as well that we are observing.
This was a perfect last word, but I would like to add to this that when we are doing DMA and DSA, Viviane Reding, the former commissioner, came to see me and she said, Andreas, in fact, what she wanted to do with GDPR at the time was also that asymmetrical legislation. But unfortunately, in the end, I don't want to blame anyone, but in the end, it went wrongly because we stick to the principle of minimum harmonization and everyone wanted to participate. And unfortunately, for one market, this doesn't work anymore. And I think this is also a certain consequence that we have taken, and we have been seeing that it's proven if we have one law that fits it all, if it's good, it's an advantage for the European Union.
With that, we're going to conclude. Anu, thank you and congratulations on your new book and best of luck as you go forward. And thank you to the other panelists for joining. I thought that was a really good discussion, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everyone.